financing, debt financing is always available.
Minister Monsef, you want to add something?
So, as you know, Minister Freeland, our Foreign Affairs Minister, has been involved in the Lima Group. We'll be meeting on Monday I think they've had over a dozen meetings so far to stay current on the situation. While we all know that there is no place like home, that as we saw in the video, people would rather stay where their roots are. We recognize that many Venezuelans will not return to their home anytime soon. And the humanitarian response is critical, but a more long-term development response is needed. And the more comprehensive our approach is, the easier the strain is on the generous communities who are opening their doors, who are opening their borders, and welcoming their neighbors into their communities. And that's why Canada's announced close to $53 million to support with stabilization, with humanitarian development support, specifically focused too on the most marginalized, the most vulnerable, and to support those hosts who have opened their doors. And part of what was referenced earlier, part of our commitment in Canada has been contributing $17 million to the World Bank's Global Concessional Financing Facility, which will support Colombia's generous approach to integrating Venezuelans, as well as $1 million in technical assistance through the World Bank in direct support of Colombia's migration response. When we apply that gendered lens that I was sharing with you earlier, women and girls, persons with disabilities, we know that they are powerful agents for change, and yet they are undervalued. What if we started providing them with wraparound supports to gain the skills they need to be active contributors to their families, getting on their feet and establishing some level of stability? And so we're working on providing some of that technical support and skills training so that that financial independence can be gained sooner, so that that integration process is less painful, both on the families and generations to come, but also on the communities that are hosting them.
Thank you, Minister. Let me remind the audience, you can follow us using the hashtag Venezuelan Exodus or numeral Éxodo Venezolano. You can send us your questions via Twitter or Facebook too, and we will try to have them answered in just minutes. Minister Carrasquilla, we already said Colombia is the main recipient of migrants from Venezuela. What kind of impact has it had on the country's budget? Recently, President Duque asked to flexibilize the fiscal rule, which is a big word, knowing that risk rating agencies follow that we apply to the fiscal rule.
Well, the number is basically around $1.5 billion per year is our estimation. As long as the flow of migrants continues, that there is a process by which the initial migrants gradually assimilate themselves into our labor markets, into our institutions. The new ones come, so it's basically $1.5 billion per year. So all of this help that we are receiving from Canada, from Norway, from the UK, and the World Bank coordinated all of those donations, amount to a significant amount of money, which is something like $30 million, which we are extremely grateful for, and which we will use very well. But you have to be relative in this, and so $30 million in the $1.5 billion, you know, it is cute. And the second thing I want to say is, you know, we have to think in the financial area. Someday, this nightmare that the Venezuelans are going through is going to end, and the region has an enormous responsibility to be ready, because the day after the solution comes, the Venezuelans are going to need to import food, drugs. They will need trade finance mechanisms which have to be prepared beforehand. We cannot improvise. They will need to reconstruct their electricity sector. They will need to provide water to the population, the basic needs. So I think that the region has a responsibility to prepare itself for that. And I think in that case, when there is light at the end of the tunnel, I think that the real important resources have to be put forth. So in terms of Colombia, we have to take this as a temporary shock, negative for us in the short term, positive for us in the medium to long term. And it is part of our DNA to be part of the solution in Venezuela. Historically, Colombians migrated to Venezuela. So millions of Colombians migrated to Venezuela. So basically, it is just reciprocity and a long-term view. But I am concerned about the preparation for the moment in which this problem gets solved. I think that the way we have to finance this, the 1.5 billion has to come from Colombian taxpayers, basically. My concern is what happens the day after the problem is solved. Are we ready for that financially? Are we ready for that technically? Are we ready for that in terms of trade finance? And so on.
What would you say to the risk ratings agencies in the case Colombia needs to move the fiscal rule as President Duque proposed?
Well, we still have the same targets in fiscal terms. We have the exact same targets, although the people who study this in Colombia and the experts say this is a temporary shock. This is not a permanent shock. Your long-term debt targets are not affected by a temporary shock. They are affected by a permanent shock. So since this is temporary, the fiscal concern is a short-term liquidity concern, not a long-term sustainability concern. So the change in the rule of the fiscal rule does not compromise in any way the sustainability of our finances. Even though it's a lot of money, it's a sustainable expenditure because it is temporary.
Thank you. Minister Martinez, by law, Ecuadorian and non-Ecuadorian people receive basic services in your country. But if the number of migrants increases, are you able to still give this assistance for non-Ecuadorians?
Mira, la ley de movilidad humana.
The legislation of human mobility, and not just that legislation, but the actual constitution guarantee that everybody in Ecuador that have the nationality and have immigrated to the country may have the services and guarantee from the state regarding the social services. The Ecuadorian condition in macroeconomic terms and fiscal sustainability is much more fragile in coming to grapple with this issue. Different from what Mr. Carrasquilla has said, the shock, we have had a permanent shock. We've been having a permanent shock derived not just from external factors, but rather from the public policies that mandate that we make corrective measures in the long term. And this indeed is opposed in one way or the other with this additional effort that has to be made in order to dampen this temporary shock, which is the result and is derived from migration. So there, once again, I believe that we have to think these things over in the long term, not just from the fiscal standpoint, but rather from the standpoint of future risks, that this may not become a permanent shock.
Minister Carrasquilla was saying that we have to think on the day after. The question is, how long will it take for the day after to arrive? And it could become an almost permanent shock. So I think the international community has a responsibility not only to dampen the situation and to shield the migrant population, but also to attack the roots of the problem in order to avoid a persistent problem. To the extent that the Venezuelan model continues, it will be very difficult every day will be more and more painful for Venezuelans and more difficult for neighboring countries to receive this diaspora that has been created by this model. So we have to look at it in a comprehensive manner. The financial aspects are very important for countries such as Ecuador that are moving down the road of fiscal consolidation. The buffers we are using are trying to keep the fiscal consolidation process from affecting the poorest sectors. So we have to enlarge the social safety nets. And if we add this shock, then the risk are greater in the medium to long term not to achieve the stated goals. So it's necessary for us to be aware of the fiscal problem and the funding problem for migration, but it will be solved. But there's a structural problem, and we have to revisit how we're going to manage the day after so that it becomes beneficial for Venezuelans. And in 1999, there was a large migration movement of Ecuadorians to the United States, to Spain, and to Italy. And many of them are thinking about returning if the economic situation stabilizes based on dollarization. That was a drastic decision that the country had to make, but it would guarantee future stability. That's why people are returning to Ecuador. Their children, many of them have become integrated in other communities. But I have the impression that if we compare the migratory process in Ecuador then and the Venezuelan migration nowadays, it will be much more difficult to recover that capability to rebuild the productive scaffolding of society, the cultural aspects of society. So we have to think that it's not just funding our countries in order to dampen the effects of migration, but also the future reconstruction process in a country such as Venezuela, which is not able to be fully supported by its neighbors.
The ones who already wrote the questions, please hand them on, and someone will pick it up. That way, there are someone who are picking the cards, and okay, someone else is coming to pick the other ones. This question says, and I want Mr. Stein to answer this, have any government, the UN or NGO made an assessment of what skills the migrants have so they can be integrated?
Yes. Part of the procedures that have been put in place entail a very quick assessment of the capacities, dexterities, and even professional level of those crossing the borders. Maybe the most sophisticated mechanism to date that has been applied has been done by the Brazilians, because they concentrated in the presidency the coordination of about 11 governmental ministries and general secretaries to precisely try to separate as quickly as possible from the border crossing installations those Venezuelans into other areas of the country. Argentinians have done something similar, because Argentina has enormous void territories that can use different capacities for not only agriculture but many other trades. And therefore, there is a very fast way of determining the professional or technical capacity of migrants of both sexes, and then orient those to a counterpart that has been provided, by surveys in the different departamentos or provincias to where there are technical and professional needs of those who can indeed provide services for make those economies grow and flourish. So as quickly as possible, the Venezuelans can become productive agents within those local receiving communities.
At the same time, I think we need to keep in mind that, for example, you take the doctors, that a third of Venezuelan doctors have left their country. And what that means for the Venezuelan healthcare system is catastrophic. So there is, of course, that they will hopefully find then alternative employment, and they are skilled. At the same time, you see that, of course, the gap in the country itself is going to grow in order to provide health care.
Mm-hmm. Minister Monsef, you mentioned something about volunteering when you were refugee, when you just arrived to Canada. And regarding that, I would like you to answer this question from Anna Peters from Facebook. What initiatives can governments implement so that their citizens don't see arrival of Venezuelans as an economic threat?
Thank you for your question, Anna from Facebook. It is really easy to other people and to see them as separate from you and me, they. And it is even more difficult to be welcoming when you yourself, and my colleague from Ecuador was talking about this, when your own communities are struggling, it's really hard to swallow the requirement, the expectation that you ought to be welcoming. And it's really easy to pass that down to kids. So I was bullied when I first moved to Peterborough. I didn't speak the language, I looked different, I couldn't make friends, and because I was different, I didn't have value. One of the things that the teacher at that time did, shout out to Mr. Black, he had me do a presentation to the class, and in my very broken English, had me track the routes that my family had traveled and teach the kids a few things about my people. We are actually, as part of our gender responsive investments, our programming includes measures to address xenophobia, to address the social stigmas that could come in. Ultimately, it's first things first, right? You arrive, you need to breathe, let people breathe, make them feel welcome, show kindness to strangers, and then take them out to deliver flyers with you. And if you're looking for kids to sell cookies or whatever, take them with you. That's what the organizations in my community did. The very organizations that gave us shelter had a barbecue every now and then standing outside a grocery store. So they asked us to go and help them see the value of newcomers, whether you call them refugees or migrants, see the value in them showing up and being productive and giving back as a way of reducing that otherness, reducing the racism, and showing communities what the minister is sharing, that they have value and they can contribute meaningfully.
Thank you, Minister. We are receiving a lot of questions from the room, and we'll answer some online because we don't have any more time. But I don't know if we have a chance to answer one more. If someone from the bank, let me know. Let me see. Last question. If you can, exactly. If you can bring me the question.
Are you running in heels? That's impressive.
Okay, this question is for the ministers of Colombia and Ecuador. What role do you see for private sector in your countries to support oh my God. Migrants?
That's a great question.
Okay, Minister Carrasquilla.
Within the current moment, I think that people have to be flexible in terms of hiring. The labor market in Colombia has been suffering a huge shock. So the private sector has to respond to that. It has to have flexibility. Colombia is not a migrant recipient country historically, so this is new to us, and I think we are all learning. And certainly, as the private sector, as an employer, has to adapt to this very significant shock. The second thing is, once the problem is solved in Venezuela, the Colombian private sector is going to have to play a very important role in the reconstruction of the country. You know, the banking system in Venezuela disappeared. There is no currency. There is no electricity. There is no water. There is no transmission of goods and services throughout the country. The country is uncommunicated. There's very little in the way of communication. So, and perhaps worst of all, human capital has been completely depreciated. So basically, the reconstruction implies a lot of assistance, the reconstruction of institutions, and the private sector in Colombia and other countries in the region have to have an enormous responsibility. I'm really concerned about, we are spending a lot of time, rightfully so, thinking about the tragedy of the exodus, but, and we should be concerned about it. We should be doing all that we can. But also we have to be thinking medium term, and I think that we have to be very, very ready, whether it comes in 5 days or in 5 months. It would be unforgivable as a region to be unprepared. Oh, what a surprise, the problem was solved. If that happens, I think we will have failed as a region and as a community.
Thank you, Minister. What about in the case of private sector in Ecuador, Minister Martínez?
Voy a regresar a
I'm going to go back to what I said at the beginning, that we are looking at the root causes of the problem, and the main responsibility, not only for Ecuador and for all the private sector, the church and civil society, is to try to keep these models from being replicated in the region. And I'm talking from on the basis of our own experience. We were very close to that, and we were close to the abyss. And it's very easy, actually very difficult, to think of what would have happened if Ecuador had fallen into the abyss. Under the leadership of our president now, we have more transparency, less corruption, more freedom of expression, sustainability, taking care of the poorest people. So the role of the private sector can be contributing to a joint reconstruction of the country. But this is a task not only for the private sector. So these models have an origin, which is exclusion, inequality, lack of integration, regression. And this means that the private sector should really bear in mind what is expected by society from it in a more active private sector that shares with society. Otherwise, this will create conditions that will lead to populism if the private sector does not respond. Sometimes if you talk to equity, to the private sector, then they run away, that they should be ready to discuss the issue. When I was in the private sector, we worked a lot in terms of gender equality, but it's difficult to reach that level of reflection. I want to insist on this, that as Minister Castilla was saying, this is something more in the longer term. He's talking about the reconstruction of Venezuela. I think this is extraordinary, and I agree with him that we should try to keep this from happening in other countries. For the private sector, up to a point, it has been positive to get this human capital and increase productivity. In Ecuador, the labor framework is very rigid, and it doesn't allow for a quick capture of talent. So unfortunately, the informality has made some room so that small and medium businesses have been able to hire skilled migrants. And the private sector has to look at how it can articulate with the public sector so that in the medium and longer term, the next waves of Venezuelan migrants can decide whether they can stay in the country or leave.
I want to ask our panelists if one of them want to share a final thought on this topic. Mr. Stein.
I would like to take on the three ministers' very valuable inputs. The crisis is very far from over. And even if, as we said at the beginning, tomorrow there would be a political solution, those who understand well the processes of an internationally supervised electoral process, which is one of the elements of the solution, are talking about 8 to 9 months to prepare with the proper international oversight. So the day after is really several months after, as the reconstruction of the own internal health scaffolding and basic services scaffolding is going to entail the constructive intervention in the good sense of neighboring countries that can provide a temporary help to the Venezuelans to shape up back to a reasonable way of functioning, their own institutional capacities. Thirdly, if the flow continues at the rate that it is happening now, without any sudden changes, we will be looking at the end of the year at more than 5 million, without counting those that are crossing already also on a daily basis through illegal pathways. We have decided at UNHCR and IOM to not take into account those illegal crossings, because even with internally informated or well analyzed guesses, we cannot really verify to the fullest. But if we were to take into account those illegal crossings, we are well over the 4 million mark already. So as a region, as the ministers well said, we have to be prepared for a medium-term attention of those who have already left, as well as of those extraordinary demands that will be placed inside Venezuela after a political solution.
Thank you. Mr. Van Trotzenburg, want to share any final thought?
I think that Mr. Stein is exactly right. We need to be prepared to act now where we can act, particularly with those who are refugees in the neighboring countries. But we have to prepared in the medium and long term to help in the reconstruction of this country. The good thing is that the bank was created for that. It is in the IBRD, International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. The R&D will become important, and you need to stay in the long term to be engaged. And this will require the international community as well as the private sector, because alone, without the private sector, you will also not achieve that. But the bank is ready.
Okay. So thank you to our panelists. Minister, no?
No.
Okay. Thank you to our panelists for sharing this information, for providing these valuable insights, and to the audience for your questions too, for being here. Until next time.